On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster changed the lives of millions living near the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the scientists who responded to the crisis. These are some of their stories, intimate portraits of research, innovation, discovery. Welcome, I'm Jim McNamee, editor of Dispatches from the Gulf, a series of documentaries, short videos, and podcasts. In today's podcast, we're getting down in the mud, or ocean sediments to be specific. We traveled by boat out to the waters surrounding the Chandeleur Islands, which are a chain of barrier islands that form the easternmost tip of Louisiana. We were there to meet up with a group of scientists taking samples and measurements in the muck. Leading the group was Kelly Dorgan, a senior marine scientist at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab.
We're out there studying the impacts of the oil spill on the animals that live in the sediment, and so we're looking at sites that had different amounts of oil contamination during the spill to determine whether there are differences in the composition of the communities of animals that live in sediments at those different sites.
The creatures Kelly is studying are mainly background actors in the Gulf ecosystem. We rarely think about them even though they play a considerable role.
So the animals in sediments regenerate nutrients that seagrasses use for their primary production. They also are fish food, so seagrass beds and marshes are an important nursery habitat for fish. And part of the reason for that is because there's a lot of worms and animals living in the sediment that these fish are feeding on. There's a lot that isn't known about them. If you're interested in birds, you can go out and watch a bird fly and look at it, look at its different behaviors. But if you want to study worms, it's a lot more challenging to do that, and that challenge really interested me.
The challenge includes standing for hours in waist-deep water and using snorkeling gear to dive under the surface to place and retrieve their equipment.
We were going out and deploying these metabolism chambers that measure the oxygen uptake of the sediment. And so we had 6-inch cores that we pushed down into the sediment, and depending on how deep it was, we either were wearing snorkels or not. Actually, it's not too bad. I mean, it's a workout because we walk through water and we have to dig things up. But it's not too bad. Tomorrow, everybody's taking the day off and sleeping. So we have a whole bunch of samples of these animals that we collected, and so we'll pick out all the animals and then identify the animals, and then we basically build a spreadsheet of abundances, and then we'll analyze that data. And that process will take about a year.
Kelly and her team have had to develop many of the devices and techniques used in their research on their own.
So we have a good understanding of how flight works because we understand aerodynamics and how fluids or air as a fluid works. We don't have a good understanding of the mechanical properties of sediments, and so I've gotten very interested in developing new techniques to study sediments because that really affects the animals that live in them. You can't just look at what the animals are doing and understand how they're interacting with their environment. You have to know how the environment is responding to what the animals are doing, and that's not well understood. One of the things that I think is pretty promising is using acoustics to study sediments. So if animals are mixing sediments, that changes the density and you get a difference in the sound speed through the sediment. And so we're setting up some experiments now to look at sound speed in surface sediments. We're not disturbing the animals at all, but we're still measuring the impact that they're having on their environment.
As with many studies, Kelly and her team are only in the beginning stages of their research, and any conclusions are a long way off.
It's still really early. It takes us a long time to analyze the data, so we still aren't done identifying all the animals that we collected last year. We're almost done with last year's samples. The site that had more oil, we did notice fewer of some of the large animals, so some of the larger worms and some of the larger clams seemed, at least qualitatively, to be more abundant at two sites rather than the other, but without kind of going through and doing the full analysis, we can't really say a lot, but we're intrigued at least that we may find some differences.
Today, thousands of scientists, oceanographers, chemists, engineers, biologists are all working together to develop newer and better ways to understand and ease the impact of oil spills. To learn more about their work, visit our webpage at dispatchesfromthegulf.com. Funding for this podcast was provided by a grant by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. And thanks for listening.